Hi, everyone. Apologies for the AV issues. But I'm here to introduce this year's Herbert Baumer Memorial Seminar professors, Frida Escobedo, who directs her eponymous studio based in Mexico City, and Dominic Leong, a partner at New York City-based Leong Leong Architects. Frida has a long and growing list of international and national recognition, most recently receiving the 2024 Le Prix Charlotte Perriand Prize. In 2019, she was named an International Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. In 2018, her practice was selected to design the Serpentine Pavilion in London's Hyde Park, being the youngest architect to do so. And very recently, as of this year or last year, she's continued her record of being the first woman to be hired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art to design one of their galleries, the Modern Wing. And through all of this, Frida has kept and maintained an idea that teaching is a part of practice. Teaching at numerous institutions, Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, Harvard Graduate School of Design, and recently at Yale University. Dominic Leong, who is partnered with his brother Chris Leong, has similarly received recognition for their practice that is both national and international. Most recently presenting at the World Around Summit in the Guggenheim Museum. In 2019, Leong Leong was named the AIA Presidential honoree for their Los Angeles LGBT Center. In 2014, they designed the U.S. Pavilion of the Venice Biennale and were part of the curatorial team along with two of our faculty. So Dominic similarly also had in practice at Columbia Union and in the fall at Yale University. So since 1998, the Baumer seminars have always been about one practitioner or one practice. And some of you may be wondering why we have two Baumer professors this year, and why these two. Both Frida and Dominic believe that architecture discourse is a conversation with their colleagues of their generation, with clients, and with the schools in which they teach in. They share an idea that architecture is both a social and a cultural and aesthetic practice, and that they give form to it through material experimentation that they conduct in their practice and the cultural significance of these materials. It's also important, I think, to mention that Frida and Dominic have intersected in the past 10 years at different points, key points in their trajectory of their practice. In 2017, they won the Emerging Voices Award together, awarded by the Architectural League of New York. In 2018, they both exhibited at the Architecture Effects Show in the Guggenheim Bilbao, and now they both have projects at the Met, Frida with the Modern Wing, and Dominic with a project that is soon to be announced. So I'm going to end here and just kind of mention the format for today. Frida will give a short presentation, followed by Dominic, and then followed by a conversation between the three of us. So if everyone can try to stay for all three parts of the event, I want to welcome both Frida and Dominic to the Knowlton School of Architecture and invite Frida up to talk.
So let's try to. Here we go. Okay. Thank you, Fu, for the introduction and also for the invitation to come to this school. It's really a pleasure to be sharing space again with Dominic. And in this short presentation, I'm going to be talking about some of the ideas that drive the studio and some of the conceptual approach that we have for our projects. And hopefully this will provide a little glimpse of the core values in which we think about architecture. And of course, my perspective emerges from a very specific intersection of gender and geographic origins. I'm a Latin American architect, and while a substantial part of my practice is now outside of my home country, Mexico, the country still continues to inform my practice. And I think that context and place is crucial to the work we do at both offices. Mexico City is a modern metropolis with ancient roots, and it's a city characterized by creative tensions and juxtaposed realities. In this place, space is created by adapting to powerful and multifarious conditions. In other words, it is a living and breathing museum, full of layered stories from different time periods woven together. So these are some of the evidently visible characteristics. Some others are quite veiled, but all of them are deeply felt and inform our understanding of the world and how we live today. And in this context, asking the right questions is more valuable than providing answers. And this type of fluidity and interconnectedness possess an imaginative, productive character that I try to instigate in each one of my projects. So to start the list of interests that I have, I'll start with language. Much like language, I understand the practice of architecture as one that allows us to organize, express, and explain the world around us. In A Heap of Language, this drawing by Robert Smithson, he suggests that language itself grows via deposition and erosion as it gets inhabited and personalized, transferred and translated over time, just like a geological landform. Smithson's renderings of language as a site of cultural sedimentation came to mind while working on an Eco Pavilion in 2010. In this project, I approached the space like an expanse of a blank page, using cinder blocks as a structural alphabet. I was interested in how minimum of words could render a maximum of expression. The courtyard, covered in a uniform pattern, worked like a page where different typological arrangements could be used. The playful interaction with these blocks allowed the two programs to juxtapose, both the predetermined and the spontaneous. The pavilion was not just a text, but a constellation of words full of expressive potential, ignited by all visitors alike. Another topic of interest is accretion. I often refer to Roger Cala's book, The Writing of Stones, where the cutting of particular stones reveals images they concealed on the inside. Cala was not interested in nature as such, but in its relation to the imagination. The secret power of these stones, he argued, prompts a mystical materialism, which I read as something that is particularly close to Mexican culture. Their immense materiality was about immateriality, he said. Patterns found in materials such as wood or these stones, or certain types of geological formations are informed both by their own natural formation and by the conditions under which the process took place. And I think similarly, architecture evolves through accretion and erosion by inhabitation, use, exchange, and agency. The term stratification is etymologically derived from the Latin word stratum, cover, and ficere, which means make. So in a figurative sense, stratification requires a base material in order to carry out the function of the cover. According to Anne Catherine Schultz, geology uses the term stratification for the purpose of interpreting how materials are arranged. In the case of the architectural object, this stratification means the juxtaposition of layers of material. Just as this position and an order of geological strata say something about their age and their origin, the position and formulation of an architectural stratum may contain information about its function and provenance. The aesthetic effect of stratification is expressed in the details of how it is joined together in the visualized superpositioning, which demonstrates the process like nature and changeability of architecture. Moreover, spatial layering speaks about the way in which we build our environment. In this brilliant piece for the Roof Garden Commission in 2021, Lattice the Tour, that's the name of the title of the piece, Mexican artist Hector Zamora recognized the labor of bricklaying, signaling the fact that building physical space necessarily implies the construction of a social space. Material stratification, the gap layers and material planes corresponded with geological accretion, and the spatial layering, which is defined by the space between layers, is formed by human interaction. Another example of this type of stratification is this facade in Oaxaca, in Tlacolula, Mexico, which manifests as spontaneous accretions, subtractions, and reorganization of the continuous flow of the temporal rhythms of everyday life. Or this window of a modernist building in Mexico City that acted as a two-way mirror, making up an exterior that reflects and deflects, reminding us that the formation of a collective cultural self involves isolating our conceptions of the other. Buildings are invested in a great deal of expectations, and they perform very much like masks. They are performative objects open to chance, reshaped and redirected into actions of the users, their presence, and their movement. Another idea that we are always revisiting is multiplicity, identity and distinction, self and otherness, promise and failure, outwards and inwards, reflection and transparency. And central to this concept is the allegorical figure of the mask. It is a magical element making it possible to become other, to simultaneously look through and look introspectively, to bend and present towards the ancient rites that still agitate below the surface. This subsoil is not the sediment from a dead past, but a vital and active constituent of our present reality. In a similar fashion, buildings work as a symbol of the relationships between individuals and the real collective coexistence. An example could be La Tallera Museum in Cuernavaca, a project that I also did in 2010, which introduces the raw pyramid pattern concrete block screen to mask the interior spaces. Behind the building's veil is a new program for modern and contemporary art exhibitions, education studios, and artist residencies. La Tallera used to be the live workspace for the late Mexican muralist and political activist David Alfaro Siqueiros. A key gesture in our competition proposal was that the two gigantic Siqueiros murals, which were originally displayed in full from only the building's interior patio, were twisted and flipped, giving glimpses only from the exterior space, and then finally we could look at them from the interior. So the project really shifted and opened the gates and oriented the facade toward the exterior to the neighboring plaza. And to do so, we took down the perimeter wall, making the private patio public and extending the square's dimensions into this location. And the angular direction they now have is public, inviting access to the museum. And rather having a private outdoor event, the new designated space extended into the existing plaza. And this was part of the risk of doing that competition. We were losing part of the space of the museum, but we were actually activating the surrounding space. And you can see here that because of the different levels that the plaza provided, we could create pockets for activity for all the users, like this would be the cafe, the reading spaces that would sit in the back of the artwork. So the artwork was first and the activities were second. Matter and meaning is another interest of mine, and central to one of the most recent projects, Ray Harlem, residential building located in New York City, is the legacy of the National Black Theater founder, Dr. Barbara Ann Tier, whose methodology integrates West African mythology, ritual, and symbolism. The project manifests this energy through the medium of built space, even down to the color of the brick. The pink-red hue references the Osun Osogbo sacred grove in Nigeria, honoring the original artisans behind the MBT space. So these are some of the experiments that we were doing with materials and all the iterations that we were developing for developing the color of the facade. And our interest in materiality and modulation can also be seen in Mar Tirreno, a project finished in 2018, a middle house income housing project in Mexico City. The use of custom-made cinder block eliminated the need of superfluous finishes while also providing a strong, sophisticated aesthetic. With this gesture, as soon as the masonry was done, the project aesthetic intention was complete. Moreover, it will age nicely and we will need, hopefully, very little maintenance. And the decision to use just one material for walls, screens, floors, all of the finishes from the building, saved enough budget to be able to propose to the client a more generous layout. So instead of stacking 9 units on top of each other, like the original plan was proposed, and which would have been the easiest, most affordable layout, we proposed an 8 duplex houses and single house scheme arranged around the central courtyard. And each one of the units now is organized around a private courtyard, allowing for better light and natural ventilation of all of these spaces. And unknowingly, these conditions became very valuable during the pandemic. It's something that everyone was looking for. And it was because of the understanding of the possibilities of a very humble material like cinder block that we were able to reshape the whole configuration of these units, creating these different atmospheres. So each one of the units is arranged in a checkerboard effect, and the screen provides some division and filtering for private moments and also open spaces. And then the materials have become not just important in terms of their modulation, but also like how we can make these modular pieces more efficiently and in terms of environmental responsibility by developing new materials. This is a project that we're developing currently, and it's in very early stages. It's a mezcal distillery in Mexico, in Oaxaca, where we're currently developing an adobe piece that is being produced in collaboration with Oxara, a company that aims to facilitate the reuse of waste material and to enable access to sustainable and affordable housing. And the project transforms the highly acidic pollutant residue of the production of mezcal called vinaza, which is a very acidic liquid, into some of the main holding agents. And it also uses the bagazo, or the residual fibers of the agave plants, as holding agents. This is an image of the bagazo and how it's highly pollutant to the land in Oaxaca. The bagazo residue, and then finally how we're combining these two ingredients to create this new block. And the project also incorporates a strong gender perspective. Yola, the name of the brand, is one of the very few women-owned mezcal companies in the country. And the company focuses on breaking the status quo by hiring only women to distill, bottle, and sell the product, which is really unusual in the Mexican market. And this new model in the world of mezcal could provide jobs and incomes and eventually have a larger impact on multiple communities where the production is developed. One of the most interesting aspects of this project is that the owners acknowledge the double shift that most women endure, the paid work and the unpaid domestic labor, and proposed to switch the corporate employees' cafeteria for a communal kitchen, for example, that would allow workers to bring food back to their home, reducing the time of labor at home. The program would also incorporate a communal orchard, a childcare facility, and safe spaces for victims of domestic violence. This is some of the very initial visualizations of the communal kitchens and some of the common spaces. And then thinking about activation and engagement, which is something that no matter the scale that we work on, we design with the anticipation of social interaction. And this was perhaps most visible in the case of the civic stage, a piece commissioned in 2013 for the Lisbon Architecture Triennial. And the piece, as you can see, is a 15-meter wide circular stage that hosted the Triennial's public program, which ranged from performative spaces, lectures, workshops, and a city politic gathering. These are some of the images of the opening event and the mayoral act, where all the major candidates for the city gathered to debate in the circle. And conceptually, the design was very simple. It was the idea to give literal agency to all of the participants and to have the physical weight of the audience raise the voice of the speaker. So the implicit claim was that the whole world is a stage, and those on the ground, when working collectively, could gain a voice and visibility to issues that matter. And another example of a temporary structure is, of course, the Serpentine Pavilion. The main idea was to create something very simple, again, modular and with a very humble material, But also, the intention was to surround the visitor with the simplest of means, and in doing so, to channel their attention to a specific set of changes and convergences in our ambient world for them to track and to lock in place. And the essence of this process was simply to place the experience of time at the heart of the physical structure, but performing a pair of simple moves in the space. The first move was to establish a firm regulatory line or datum that snaps to grid with the Earth's rotational axis. That means that it's aligned to the true north. And this mark is announced explicitly as an alignment with the Greenwich Meridian, which is located in London, where the pavilion was located. And the second one was to rotate the axis of the pavilion's outer walls to align with the local integer of reference, which was the Serpentine Gallery. And the reason why we do that, and I was talking about that this morning, is that the pavilion broke with two concepts that we always learn in architecture school, and that is that architecture is site-specific and it's permanent. In this case, the pavilion moves after it's being installed in the Serpentine Pavilion, and it's sold to either an institution or a private client, and the location is undisclosed. So actually it needed to function in any geography and in a permanent way. So it was temporary and site-specific, and it was permanent but without any fixed location. So this way of thinking more abstractly of time and space was what helped us to anchor the pavilion in place and for it to have an echo wherever it moved into a different location. So the meridian line, and then having this screen as a way of interacting with the immediate surroundings and actually having these mirror effect that divided and joined these two different geometries into place. It kind of became a sundial and also a place for gathering and enjoyment. These are some of the images, and as you can see, it became like very evident that the passing of time was something that was very relevant for this project, not just in the way that you were moving through space, but also how it acted on a larger calendar almost. And then thinking about visibility, I'm very interested in the idea of how architecture can also serve as a way to conceal specific behaviors. And this type of selective concealment is actually quite typical, though we don't acknowledge it. Architectural detailing, for example, hides the processes and defects of construction and hides the complex mechanisms of the building. But also there are certain social interactions that are concealed through architecture. And this is something that I first noticed as a participant in the project Ordus 100, and that happened in 2007, where 100 architects were invited to design a villa that would be the house of the future, and in a collective arrangement. And the single-family house in the program included two kitchens. One that would be the wet kitchen, or the actually used kitchen, and the dry kitchen, which was only thought about for as display and presentation. So this really triggered something in my mind, like how are we actually perpetrating certain specific behaviors through the creation of architecture. So this research on this project that was never realized actually derived into this publication that we continue to develop. The first format is Domestic Orbits, a format of a small book, almost like a magazine format, that studies all the relationships of domestic spaces, particularly paid domestic labor in Mexico City, and what are the mechanisms of architecture for concealing that space. We have done a series of analyses, including Pritzker Prize architecture, like the Barragan studio in Mexico City, where we can analyze specific moments of the architectural space where this type of corridors and compartments of doors actually conceal the choreography of the domestic labor in the house. And we want to reveal that and show the architecture can also perpetuate some of these images. So finally, as a conclusion and thinking about the future and the work that lies ahead, I think that fluidity possesses an imaginative, productive character in my projects. These are not designed to organize the imagination, but to instigate it. My architecture is not one of control, and it departs from an unearthing of the historical, social, and geological layers of the site, where stratification is exposed and provoked. And hopefully this challenges the power relationships between people, space, and matter. And this involves necessarily a reflection in time, an interpretation of existing traces, and a concern for the new ones that we will leave. I hope that my architecture bears the marks of duration, life, and weathering, and it reveals the underlying stratum of social psyche. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Frida. Really amazing to, just see all the work together. It's very stunning. And thanks to OSU for obviously having both of us here. It's really an honor to be a part of the Baumer legacy and be in conversation with Frida, who's a great friend. And as Fu said, we've intersected at different points in our careers, which has been really a privilege and a pleasure. I think where do I start? I mean, this short presentation is really a meditation on home, sort of elaboration on thinking about home that I think has started for us and for different reasons. We think about home partly because much of our work involves some sort of housing, whether it's social housing or a private house. And since we're curious people, we believe that architecture should rise to meet our most pressing challenges and help imagine new futures. We're not interested in any single typology or project, but rather the whole ecosystem of spaces and experiences that make up our everyday lives, that shape culture, that hold us together as communities and also as a planetary civilization. And within these ecosystems and life worlds where we live and eat and work and play, we've been curious about who feels at home in these spaces. Whose bodies are these spaces designed for? And how does form and materiality come together to make a stool, a house, or an institution feel like it opens up new worlds for us, for you? So this is our home in New York City of Leong Leong in Chinatown. I opened the office with my brother Chris around 2009. We've been in that area ever since, and it's really been important for us to be in Chinatown. I think it's important to acknowledge that our practice has had over 60 people participate in its work and its evolution. We're currently about 8 people, and we really couldn't have done any of the work without the collaboration of these individuals. So I just really want to express my gratitude towards that. And I think what we're really thinking about is home at the intersection of an aesthetic practice, an ecological practice, and a social practice. And home is not a house. So if home is not a house, then what is it? And what does it mean to ask this question today? And whose home are we talking about? What does it mean to think about home within our housing crisis, within our ecological crisis? And what does it mean to recover ideas of home that have been erased? And what does it mean to think about home across scales and geographies? And how do we not just live together, but how do we live together well? So when we think about home in the context of Napa Valley, where Chris and I grew up, life has changed drastically because of recent wildfires in just a matter of a few years. Places that I remember as lush and green and forest were literally scorched. Homes and communities across California decimated within hours, sometimes even minutes. So in our climate crisis, many homes are increasingly in fire zones. You may have heard of these kind of harrowing stories of people surviving these fires by jumping in their pools, sheltered in their basements. So when we were asked to design a home on a steep hill in Mount Washington in Los Angeles, we thought about creating a home as a refuge in a wildfire. What was needed was a stark contrast to the sprawling, light and airy, iconic case study homes of the last century, notoriously under-insulated. And instead, we designed a compact and passively cooled home that could save its inhabitants from a fast-moving wildfire. Prefabricated modules stack on top of a concrete plinth that serve as a safe zone. Sandwiched in between the modules is a stairwell that connects each floor, acting as a thermal chimney, pulling air through the different living spaces on each level. So we're also interested in the typological innovation that's required and needed to address how new ways of living respond to ecological crisis within specific geographies. In this project in Asheville, North Carolina, we were asked to envision a building for a local artist community in the River Arts District. The site sits within the floodplain along the river that the Cherokee called Takioti, or Racing Waters, otherwise known as the French Broad River today. And as you may know, Asheville has this long legacy of craft and artist practice, Black Mountain College, and this project really kind of falls into that legacy. The program given to us was really a kind of interesting convergence of affordable artist housing, a workshop, a makerspace, a hostel, converging in a way, a kind of commercial program with a sort of nonprofit one. So the site is located here in the floodplain, so essentially the typological innovation, which draws on the legacy of some projects you might be familiar with, like Unité de Habitation, but places that diagram within the floodplain itself. The form of the building responds very specifically to the zoning code and the constraints around bulk volume, and thinks about a mass timber structure that creates a kind of unique assemblage and aggregation of or hybrid program for this particular site. And so what you can see is a sort of structural mass timber frame that creates a sort of in-between space and outdoor space that becomes balconies for the various units for living, community space, et cetera. So home can also be in a cul-de-sac. For this project, we were given a very interesting brief by a family in Los Angeles to renovate their existing home. The couple who run a contemporary art gallery asked us to do three things. First was to create an environment that felt like it was a home for art, but not saturated by it. Second was to make the home as sustainable as possible and only renovate 50% of the existing structure, partly due to some zoning constraints. And last was to challenge the aesthetic and programmatic cliches of domesticity and their boundaries. So we began exploring ways to rethink the suburban house, reconfigure it, its relationship with the entire lot. We were interested in how a series of figures or the composition of walls could create new relationships between inside and outside that start to redefine both the exterior spaces, but also the interior spaces. So you can see this kind of 1970s suburban ranch house starts to take on a totally different configuration in terms of how this continuous wall that intersects the footprint of the existing house creates these entry courtyards and courtyard off the backyard that pulls you through the space and starts to kind of reconfigure the inside and outside and actually treat like the whole site as a domestic space, inside rooms, outside rooms. And so here on the right, you can see the new kitchen, which opens up onto a xeriscaped rock garden. And in a way creates a very materially distinct environment that kind of draws on the everyday materials of Los Angeles, like stucco, polycarbonate, etc. One of the things that they suggested in the program was that they didn't want a dining room, but they actually preferred a co-working space. And so here you can see the co-working space and what is essentially considered the living room. And instead of a kind of family room, they really thought about this idea of a media cube that could be both for watching TV as a family, but also for screening art. Wow, these slides are totally different than what I anticipated them to be. And so in a lot of ways, it's really about thinking about this legacy of suburbia, artists who have transformed it like Dan Graham, or thinking about these kind of ways of bringing everyday life to the outside into these kind of outdoor spaces. So the original footprint, which you can see here, which is sort of subdivided in traditional kind of public and private areas of the house, starts to get reconfigured by this continuous wall that kind of redefines the relationship between the public and private areas. So on the right, you still have the bedrooms. In the middle, you have this courtyard that then extends into the main living space, and the courtyards behind, and sort of kind of redefines that as the main public space in the house. Getting a pop-up here, Wi-Fi. So essentially a series of study models that start to explore how the kind of inversion of the existing house happens with this large continuous figure wall. Okay. Interesting. So just a series of images that kind of walk you through the house, and in a lot of our projects, we're exploring everyday materials and how they're sort of repurposed. So in this case, we cast a series of concrete tiles, or the surface of the media cube is essentially an off-the-shelf product of aluminum extrusions. I'm just going to skip through these. So as we move from the domestic scale to the civic scale, in 2014, we're commissioned to design a new home for the Los Angeles LGBT Center in Hollywood. And it was really an opportunity to think about home at an institutional scale as an intergenerational network of needs that gives a civic presence to the LGBTQ community within the city of Los Angeles. The campus converges social services and affordable housing that were spread across Hollywood and originated in a network of liberation houses which were home to the grassroots activism of LA's queer culture and communities in the 1970s. And this project really kind of prompts a question around what does it mean to create a home that's a sanctuary for the LGBTQ community, but is also an institution interface for the city. So in a lot of ways, this project sits in a kind of interesting tension between these different needs or desires of the project. And so as we were exploring these kind of different scales of home relative to the scale of a house or the scale of an institution, we started looking at precedents that were both local and also within the legacy of modernism. So on the left, you have a Hollywood courtyard house, and you also have on the right the Berlin Free Matte building. And we were interested in the kind of how the porosity of both projects used outdoor space as part of the living space, and as well as buffered between different programs. So we began exploring like how these different spatial organizations could address a domestic scale and also an institutional scale while using outdoor space as buffer and a kind of continuity to connect, but also separate programs. So the building itself starts to translate these programmatic elements into sort of unique figures or volumes, which create a kind of diversity of identities that are unified through a sort of consistent material of glass curtain wall and stucco that start to create kind of multiplicity, but also cohesion of how the building has a certain identity or presence. And then we were exploring ideas of porosities through different ways of opening the building, through courtyards, through skylights. And one of the kind of key issues in the project is to think about how the building can open up to create moments of interface to the public, but also have a certain degree of privacy to really create a sense of like intimacy for both the kind of intergenerational community that lives there, which includes a youth shelter, 5 different types of supportive housing, all the way to 110 units of senior housing, which you can see on the right, the courtyard here. One of the key spaces in the project, which wasn't actually part of the program, was what is called Pride Hall. And what we identified over the course of working with the center, the LGBT center, was that in addition to this network of needs, there was also a desire for a space of celebration. And that's what emerged from this, a kind of community space that could be used for anything from a wedding to community dance classes. So just imagine Earth, Wind, and Fire playing with this dance class. It was quite amazing to work on that project and just see how people have started to live in it and really make it their own. The next project that really also speaks to this idea or this tension between home and institution. In 2020, we partnered with PS1 to think about how to utilize the courtyard. You may be familiar with the Young Architects program that has had this long legacy of commissioning young architects to do activations in the courtyard. And the institution had since sunset that in 2019, and there was a lot of questions around what to do with the courtyard. So when we partnered with them, we really decided that it wasn't actually about proposing any solutions, but actually designing a process to bring people to the table who weren't a part of the conversation. So, what we put together was essentially a series of workshops with a sort of network of people working in technology, artists, social justice, policy, et cetera. But what was really critical was actually inviting neighborhood organizations to the table who historically had never had any relationship to the museum. And what we learned was by kind of centering that conversation first, there was really no connection between the immediate neighborhood and that community and the institution. And then the presence of this courtyard that was built was actually interpreted as almost like a prison. So the interesting evolution of the institution that started in the 1970s as this artist enclave within the area of Queens, which historically was very industrial, the reality that this artist enclave actually contributed to the gentrification of the area and what it is now. So in the course of designing this process and asking a multitude of people to come to the table and think with us about the courtyard, it really became about creating a space within PS1 to capture that conversation and essentially create a laboratory for engagement and activation and start to open up the workshops to invite visitors and community groups within the neighborhood to participate in that conversation. And so what that led to was commissioning an artist and urbanist named Michelle Cara, who has a unique practice in terms of mapping, community mapping, and mapping urbanism. And one of the important aspects was to understand how PS1 fit into a larger ecosystem, a larger set of community resources. And in order to do that, it really meant inviting people in to start to identify both the formal and informal spaces surrounding PS1 and how the institution can rethink what the courtyard can do for them. So there's tons of amazing ideas, from like a permaculture garden to a kind of safe space. There's a lot of conversations around whether the opacity of the wall was something that was desirable or not desirable. And so it's prompted a lot of kind of conversations within the institution, exactly how it can actually feel more like home. And so the last kind of theme here is thinking about the body as a home, and how we situate our bodies within the ecological, this aesthetic and social, and how architecture can meet us there and make us more aware of our bodies, reminders that we have bodies. So we've done a series of projects that range from kind of meditation studio, objects that engage the body. This is a furniture piece that was a commission of a group show in which we designed a series of kind of objects that move, that you sit on, that have different configurations. It activates the body. It's kind of active seating. And the last project where I'll land is a project we did at the Schindler House as part of an exhibition called Soft Schindler. And so as we transition from home at the scale of what was the civic care, and we come back to the idea that home is not a house, but home as a ritual of care. One of the most iconic homes of the 20th century is the Schindler House, designed by Schindler in 1922 as a unique experiment in domesticity. It was designed as for two families that were to live together in connected but separate parts of the house. But the history of this home is complicated. Much of it has been erased. And so Mimi Zeiger, the curator of the show entitled Soft Schindler, really focused on the recovery of the story of Pauline Schindler, Rudolph's wife, whose presence in the history of the house has been all but erased. And I don't think this video is going to play, but let's see. So reflecting on the life of the house as an experiment in domesticity, we designed 3 stone vessels for a culinary experiment, inviting 2 fermentation experts, Ai Fujimoto and Jessica Wang. Ai and Jessica spent 3 months fermenting miso and lemons that were then served at a dinner party where we invited artists, designers, and curators from across Los Angeles to bring domestic life back into this house. For us, this project was about recognizing that home is not just an object or a single space, but is complex and relational, a network of spaces and connections that make up our everyday lives, some material, some immaterial, some formal, some informal, some permanent, some ephemeral, some fixed, and some that will always be fluid. There's this really amazing soundtrack, so just... And I will just end my talk with sharing a Hawaiian term, kipuka, which is recently we're doing a lot of work in Hawaii. We have Hawaiian family and ancestry, so it's been really important for us to think about how we recover indigenous knowledge within the context of Hawaiian cultural practice. And one of the words that has emerged is kipuka. And it has a lot of different meanings. In Hawaiian culture, words can be understood from many different vantage points through a totally different type of epistemology. But the Hawaiian dictionary defines it as a variation or change of form, puka whole, as a calm place in a high sea, deep place in a shoal, opening in a forest, opening in cloud formations, and especially a clear place or an oasis within a lava bed where there may be vegetation. And so the last project I'll show is really thinking about this idea of kipuka. What does it mean to create architecture within the context of ecological crisis and social turmoil and the need for regenerative spaces, but also the understanding that in the case of a lava flow, this kind of destruction is also an opportunity for new growth to survive. And in Hawaiian culture, the idea of the kipuka is not just an ecological moment of regeneration, it also is a metaphor for cultural and social regeneration. And we did a small project that's, in a lot of ways, some of our projects are really thinking about what is the most basic elemental form of architecture that connects people together. And in this case, it was designing a kipuka for a domestic environment in which two elements, a circle and a square, sort of tufted as like a thick tapestry, and kind of can come together to provide a space of sanctuary for meditation, play, rest, etc. And so this, in a way, I think, embodies the ethos of what we aspire to with our architecture, is to create spaces like kipukas that are regenerative socially, ecologically, and offer spaces of ritual and care. Thank you.
Thank you. It's not the night for AV. So thank you, Frida. Thank you, Dominic. And I think that what I really enjoyed about the presentations was that which is expected as overlaps between your work, as well as that which is perhaps less expected or unexpected. So one thing I want to start with is Frida's website, which I think we had touched upon in the seminar today, organized into just very quite simply that which is permanent, that which is temporary. But I think it actually applies to both your practices, working in things that we know more within the discipline of architecture, buildings and interiors and urban spaces, and then on the other hand, exhibits, installations, convenings, like this, the world of architects that, you know, has become more and more part of contemporary practice. But besides project types, what I find very interesting is this: if you could apply the same logic to materials that are more permanent, and materials that change with time. And you know, for Frida, I think there is this idea of change that is slow time, bricks and concrete blocks that change very slowly, and that you really try to change that occurs so slowly, and you celebrate that slowness. And in some ways, I would say, Dominic, that the change that happens in some of the materials that you're using are faster. Salt that degrades quickly, or foam that sets, you know, within a certain period of time. So I'm trying to actually piece together, in the spirit of this kind of conversation between two points. One, which is about slow time and your material practices and fast time. The other is learning from indigenous practices, indigenous and vernacular practices that perhaps operate in both slow and fast time. So, you know, getting to the question today, earlier in the seminar, Frida said that, you know, identity is always about a state of becoming, a process of becoming. So I was wondering if you could try to connect the material practice of your practices and the focus on local or indigenous practices.
Yeah, this work. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It's very precarious. Yeah, I think kind of, you know, at some point. Yeah, is it on? How's that? Okay. Yeah, I think time. I've always kind of thought you could attribute different architects to different speeds or different senses of time. That there was architects who were about slowing down time, and there was architects who were more interested in speeding up time or being part of the now. And in some ways, I think the question kind of is compelling, because I'm curious, Frida, I mean, I perceive your work as slowing down time in a lot of ways and having a sense of deep time. And I think that deep time also connects to, I think, being conscious of, like, what do we mean by indigenous, but to place, maybe, culture and place. And I think for me and how I think about time and materials, and maybe Frida, you pointed this out, there's a like contemporaneous like use of materiality sometimes that might have like a shelf life, for example. Then in some ways I'm sort of like compelled by this idea of like modulating time, like moving between fast and slow, having this kind of weird conundrum of like needing to keep up with where the world's headed, but also simultaneously wanting to slow it down. And so maybe I think what you're suggesting is like, that might suggest an approach to materiality that is present in different ways.
But I think it has to do also with geography, or at least now that I have two offices, I've noticed that maybe that aim to slow down time, as you're mentioning, is because in Mexico, for example, we think about the permanence of things because there's little possibilities of changing things. It's not part of the economic system. Whether in the US, maybe the value is like to keep changing things because that activates a different kind of economy. But what is funny is that when I'm thinking more about more permanent architectures, actually they need to be more flexible and need to be less defined. So there's kind of like these double play when you think about something that becomes more permanent, then you have to think about like how it becomes really open-ended. And when you do something that is very specific, that will shift or change very quickly, then you can close it more. So openness and permanence are tied for me.
Yeah, that's actually funny because when the last project I showed, the Kipuka, we were actually thinking about a lot of similar themes, which is in the context of product design, for example, what does it mean to create a product that has an enduring presence, that actually has a certain degree of quality and material integrity, yet can be super adaptable in its form and its shape and reshaping domesticity and like different ways of living. And so I think that's a really interesting tension between permanence and adaptability as it relates to materiality and form, for example.
Yeah, you mentioned geography, location, Frida. So I think that there's kind of both of your practices are working. There's a parallel in how you work, which is that you're working in two places, right? Frida spending her office is based in Mexico City, where there's probably more forms of experimentation possible than New York, where you spend half of your month, right? And Dominic based in New York, but doing a lot of work in LA, which also has its own culture of experimentation. At the same time, you have two very distinct constituencies that you're designing for. On the one hand, historically underrepresented communities, whether it be the LGBTQ Center in LA, the Ray Harlem building in New York, or the work that I know that you've done for the Asian Americans for equality. And then you're also designing for the largest art museum in the world, right? Or other large cultural institutions. How do you think the geography helps you or hinders you with these kind of working between different constituencies?
I mean, I think it's inevitable, no? Like we carry who we are, where we come from, some of our experiences into the work that we're developing wherever it is. So it might seem that it resonates more within our original geography, but I have the feeling that at least in New York, it's a city of immigrants. So there's like a shared feeling that everyone comes and brings something new and has a different kind of past, and the common ground is that everyone is different, and that's what's so fascinating about it. So, yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I also feel like a strange tension between an increasing desire to be super localized, and I think maybe it's like the hangover of like the last 20 years of like globalization and the kind of effects or the way architecture responded to that, and kind of asking, is that the way we want to practice? Do we want to follow in that legacy of doing projects all over the world and having a kind of limited understanding of where we're actually working and the cultures that we're working in? Or, you know, some ways I think the most radical way to practice is just to work in one place. Whether that's like a reality or not is like another question. I think for me it's maybe like a fantasy at this point, already having established what is, you know, somewhat global practice. But I think I think the great thing about having this Baumer lecture series with kind of quote mid-career architects is that I don't feel like I've sort of arrived at a place of certainty about where our practice like is going and will go, but there's still so many questions that seem really pertinent that I think will influence how our practice evolves. So the work that we're doing in Hawaii, which I didn't show any of it, because it's sort of in process, and there's a lot of kind of sensitivities around it relative to working with the local community there. But that has opened up so many questions, both kind of personally in terms of returning and recovering my own connection to indigeneity, but also thinking about the knowledge that is gained from cultural practice that is predicated on land-based practices of care. And as architects who work within the context of New York and mostly urban, those conversations are kind of pretty far behind relative to, I think, what's kind of going on. So anyway, I think, it's a kind of interesting thing that we need to be engaged in like global dialogues, but also be extremely rooted in understanding of specific places and cultures.
But I think, today we were talking about Glissant, no, this Martinican writer, and we didn't discuss the idea of mondialité, which is in one of the texts that we were suggesting it. And I think he proposes something that is interesting. It's not the same as globalization. No? There's this value of interconnectedness, like the network expands, but also the locality becomes very relevant in order to create that kind of relationship. So in a way, it's not just about a single common ground, but it kind of expands, and that's why it's interesting to me. No, like for example, I'm thinking about the Mexican community, or whether it's like the female community, or you start branching out, but you still have the sense of self and how you're actually creating that type of individuality through collectiveness. So that's something that's interesting.
Yeah, for me, it reminds me that, I realize as I was seeing the work that, Dominic, you mentioned the kind of domesticity that you bring outside. It's a kind of inside-out force that you're trying to design for. And Frida, a lot of the work that you're doing that I see is about an outside in, that there are these, a lot of it through material practices, like materials that are usually associated with the outside go into the domestic interiors and are used as walls and floors and often ceilings, right? And that there's a kind of push and pull, I think, between both how you practice, but also how you speak about the work. I do have other questions, but I'm going to open it up for questions from students. I don't know.
As you're all named partners in your practices, I was hoping that you would share the channels through which your firms received their first projects.
In my case, it was I did an experiment on doing this renovation that we were talking about earlier, but I consider my first project to be a single-family house, actually an individual house, and it was through a friend. So I think it can start very small, and then eventually it becomes into something else. So the first public commission was a competition, and it was La Tallera, and the first private commission was this house through a friend.
Yeah, I guess you're asking the question in the context of our professional careers. I think it was through friends. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, I've been told that, and maybe this is like outdated way of thinking, but like there's different ways of getting, projects. One is through a social network. The other one is through an institutional network. And different, for us, it happened to be through a social network.
I think the question is like whether we push these projects into our friends or they really invite us to do these commissions. No, like I think there's also this influence, of course, if you're ambitious enough or hungry enough, you will make these eagerness contagious, and then people might be enticed to work with you. No? So I think it's a two-way street.
Other questions? Varun?
So I was wondering how your practice kind of went global, because we're seeing global, like bricks, concrete, tiles, the images that you put out might feel like, to some people, to the viewers might feel like, oh, even I can have it in my region because these materials seem very close to me. And even the ideas of stratification, time, they kind of go all over the globe. So is the kind of reason why the practice went global, ideas and materials that can almost be anywhere and still come out acceptable?
I mean, I didn't think about it that way, but you're right. These are like almost universal things that actually become very local, no? Like the idea of a module is universal, but then the material which is made is very specific. So I think that that duality plays very nicely with the idea of something that could be very Mexican or very global, no? And I'm thinking about one piece by Carl André, this repetition of materials, no, and how he was describing that the piece itself was telling a story about the time and place just by understanding the module of the material, the dimensions, because it had to do with industrial production or the way things were sourced. So the storytelling behind something that is so simple is what's relevant for me, because even if it's very abstract or almost like very sparse, no, like it's a cube or it's a block, it tells a story if you look at it closely, and then it becomes really intimate and local.
Sarah?
Today we talked a lot about practices of care and listening, and how important it is to listen in order to learn from cultures that you may not identify with or be from. And I was just wondering, how do you actively listen, or how do you learn from cultures that may be new to you?
I mean, I think some of the things we discussed earlier, what I mentioned, I think, at least, within Hawaiian culture, the way you introduce yourself is where you come from, what piece of land you're from. And so there's a kind of inherent way that knowing where you come from and having kind of awareness of that, both in terms of geography, culturally, ancestry. I believe that self-awareness allows conversations to happen across cultures, and I think that's partly about, in a lot of ways, understanding one's own positionality within the world related to race, gender, class, culture, that are very important to be aware of when working within a place that you're not familiar with. And just curiosity and humility, I think, are things we try to put into practice as much as possible.
One more question? Ah, Dan.
Curious about the project where you use the concrete, and you had to kind of like show, you were telling us earlier, you had to show the client like the numbers. They cared mostly about the cost, right? You with the cinder block tile, where units that you use. What about those giant windows, doors that open up? Weren't those like very expensive to add to this project?
Good catch. It was very expensive. And of course, they were trying to, you want to have big windows, but then they won't be operable, and they're going to be aluminum. So that was another huge fight. And we had to compromise with some of the finishes inside, but in our opinion, it was more important to have the capacity to open fully that space for it to be able to expand and spill into the courtyard than having a nice kitchen countertop. So again, it's just like trying to find the right fight. And we were lucky enough that some of the units kept, made a decision. The clients actually made the decision, like the final customer made the decision of whether they want to have like the less expensive finish or the proposed finish. And some people decided to go for the more expensive finish, so we could keep both. But that was the least of the cases. And I think it's also a matter of understanding like what really is meaningful as a question and not relying too much on details and materials. No, like sometimes the material is really important. I think in the case, for example, the house that you were showing with the staircase, that becomes such a major moment that it's all about the tactility and the material and the pulse that you have with that texture. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's something that is going to be replaced and adapted, and we need to let go. And this is where I think architecture is unfinished. And even if we think that the customer is going to finish it, it doesn't. Like it just continues to become something else. No?
Thank you, Frida. Thank you, Dominic.